The morning mist clung to the Monongahela River like a shroud as 22-year-old Lieutenant Colonel George Washington emerged from his tent, unaware that his next decision would plunge two mighty empires into a war that would reshape the New World forever. It was May 28, 1754. The young Virginian had just received intelligence that would make him the inadvertent architect of global conflict. Washington's expedition into the Ohio Valley had begun as a routine diplomatic mission to deliver an ultimatum to French forces occupying what Virginia claimed as its territory. The French had been steadily expanding their influence through a chain of forts stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, effectively encircling British colonial settlements along the Atlantic coast. The competition for this vast wilderness, rich in fur-bearing animals and strategic river routes, had been simmering for decades. The Ohio Company, a land speculation venture involving prominent Virginians, including Washington's own family, had received a royal grant of 200,000 acres in the disputed territory. But French commander Claude-Pierre Picot de Contrecoeur had other plans. He had recently completed Fort Duquesne at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, strategic position that controlled access to the entire Ohio Valley. Washington's Seneca ally, known to the English as Half King, brought disturbing news to the colonial camp. A French diplomatic party led by Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville was approaching through the forest, ostensibly carrying a message similar to the one Washington himself had delivered months earlier. But Half King suspected treachery. French party was too well armed and too secretive for a mere diplomatic mission. The decision Washington made in that foggy dawn would echo through history. Rather than wait for the French to approach openly, he chose to strike first, leading 40 colonial militia and a dozen Seneca warriors. Washington surrounded the French camp in a rocky glen, now known as Jumonville Glen. The engagement lasted only 15 minutes, but its consequences would span continents. When the smoke cleared, Jumonville lay dead along with 9 of his men, killed either in the initial volley or in the confused melee that followed. The survivors, including 21 prisoners, told a different story than Washington expected. They claimed Jumonville had been carrying a diplomatic message ordering the English to withdraw from French territory, essentially the same mission Washington had undertaken for Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie. Historical context reference from the Pennsylvania Historical Society archives indicates that this encounter represented the first shots of what would become known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. The implications were staggering. If the French party had indeed been on a diplomatic mission, Washington had just assassinated an ambassador, an act that would be considered tantamount to a declaration of war. Half King's warriors scalped the dead, including Jumonville himself, making any peaceful resolution even more unlikely. Washington hastily constructed a circular palisade fort, which he optimistically named Fort Necessity. The location, in a marshy meadow surrounded by wooded hills, would prove to be tactically disastrous. As news of Jumonville's death spread through the wilderness, Washington knew that French retaliation would be swift and overwhelming. The young colonel's actions had unwittingly triggered what would become the first truly global war, fought simultaneously in North America, Europe, the Caribbean, India, and the Philippines. Neither Washington nor the French commanders could have imagined that this skirmish in the Pennsylvania wilderness would ultimately determine which European power would dominate North America, reshape the relationship between Britain and its American colonies, and set in motion the events that would lead to American independence. The rain began falling on July 3, 1754, turning the hastily constructed earthworks of Fort Necessity into a muddy death trap. Washington crouched behind the wet logs, water streaming down his face as French musket balls whistled overhead. What had begun as a bold assertion of British territorial claims was rapidly becoming a humiliating disaster that would haunt the young colonel for the rest of his life. Captain Louis Callan de Villiers had arrived with 600 French regulars and Canadian militia, accompanied by 100 Native American allies, seeking vengeance for his brother Jumonville's death. The French commander's grief had transformed into cold fury during the march from Fort Duquesne. and he intended to make the English pay dearly for what he considered the murder of a diplomatic envoy. Washington's situation was desperate. His force had been reduced to fewer than 400 men, many of whom were sick or wounded. The fort's circular design, intended to provide all-around defense, instead created a killing field where every position was exposed to enemy fire from the surrounding hills. The incessant rain had turned their gunpowder damp and their spirits even damper. The battle began at 11 in the morning when French forces emerged from the forest and immediately occupied the commanding heights around the fort. Washington's men found themselves trapped in what was essentially a bowl, with enemy marksmen firing down on them from positions of superior cover. The young colonel's tactical inexperience showed as he realized too late that he had built his fort in the worst possible location. As the hours passed, the situation grew increasingly dire. The French and their Native American allies maintained a steady fire that prevented Washington's men from raising their heads above the walls. Several attempts to organize sorties failed when men refused to leave the minimal protection of the trenches. The rain continued to fall, creating a quagmire that made movement nearly impossible and rendering much of their ammunition useless. According to historical accounts preserved in the Virginia colonial records, Washington later described this engagement as his most humiliating military experience, surpassing even his later defeat at the Battle of Brandywine. By evening, nearly 100 of Washington's men had been killed or wounded. The survivors huddled in the flooded trenches, sharing what little dry gunpowder remained, while French voices echoed through the darkness. Many of the colonial militia spoke of surrender, their morale completely shattered by the day's carnage. When Captain de Villiers sent a messenger under a flag of truce, Washington faced the most difficult decision of his young military career. The French terms were surprisingly generous. The English would be allowed to withdraw with their weapons and personal effects, but they must sign a document acknowledging their wrongdoing in the death of Jumonville and promise not to return to the Ohio Valley for 1 year. Washington's interpreter, Captain Jacob Van Brom, struggled to translate the French document by candlelight in the rain-soaked fort. The crucial phrase "l'assassinat du sieur de Jumonville" is rendered as the killing of Jumonville rather than the assassination of Jumonville. This translation error would have profound consequences, as Washington unwittingly signed a confession to murder rather than simply acknowledging a military engagement. The surrender ceremony took place at midnight on July 4th. 1754, a date that would later hold very different significance for Americans. Washington's bedraggled column began their humiliating retreat in the early morning hours, leaving behind their artillery, most of their supplies, and any pretense of British dominance in the Ohio Valley. The defeat at Fort Necessity sent shockwaves through the American colonies and across the Atlantic to London. The British government, already concerned about French expansion in North America, began planning a massive military response. King George II authorized the deployment of regular British troops to America for the first time since the early colonial period. Washington's surrender document, with its damning admission of assassination, provided the French with a propaganda victory that resonated throughout European diplomatic circles. The young Virginian's military reputation lay in ruins, but the larger consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold across 2 continents. The morning of July 9th, 1755, dawned clear and humid in the Pennsylvania wilderness as Major General Edward Braddock's massive expedition approached the Monongahela River. The 60-year-old British commander, resplendent in his scarlet uniform despite the oppressive heat, surveyed his force of over 2,000 men. With satisfaction, British regulars, American militia, and artillery pieces stretched in a column nearly 4 miles long through the dense forest. Surely enough firepower to crush any French resistance at Fort Duquesne, Braddock had arrived in America with supreme confidence in European military tactics and profound disdain for both colonial soldiers and wilderness warfare. He commanded 2 regiments of British regulars, the 44th and 48th, foot only along with colonial troops from Virginia, Maryland, and other colonies. His artillery train included massive siege guns capable of reducing Fort Duquesne to rubble, transported at enormous expense over hundreds of miles of wilderness roads. George Washington, now serving as a volunteer aide-de-camp despite his recent humiliation at Fort Necessity, had repeatedly warned Braddock about the dangers of European-style warfare in the American wilderness. The young Virginian, along with experienced frontiersmen, like Daniel Boone and Christopher Geist, urged the general to adopt more flexible tactics suited to forest fighting. Braddock dismissed these suggestions with characteristic arrogance, declaring that savages could never stand against disciplined European soldiers. The expedition had been plagued by difficulties from the beginning, the sheer logistics of moving such a large force through wilderness where roads had to be carved from virgin forest had consumed months of preparation. Braddock's insistence on bringing heavy artillery and maintaining European standards of supply had slowed progress to a crawl. Local Native American tribes, initially neutral, had been alienated by the general's high-handed treatment and gradually drifted toward the French alliance. As the column approached the Monongahela, Braddock's scouts reported no signs of French activity. The general's spirits rose further when his advance guard successfully crossed the river without opposition. Fort Duquesne appeared to be lightly defended, and Braddock began planning his siege operations with characteristic thoroughness. Contemporary accounts preserved in the British military archives describe Braddock's confidence as bordering on hubris in the hours before the engagement. Captain Daniel Leonard de Beaujeu, the French commander at Fort Duquesne, faced an impossible situation. His garrison numbered fewer than 500 men, mostly Canadian militia and Native American allies from various tribes. Against Braddock's overwhelming force, conventional defense was hopeless. Instead, Beaujeu chose a desperate gamble and ambush attack using tactics perfectly suited to wilderness warfare. The French and their Native American allies positioned themselves in dense woods on both sides of the British line of march, taking advantage of every fallen log, boulder, and tree for cover. They waited silently as Braddock's column advanced in perfect formation, drums beating and colors flying through the narrow forest path. The ambush erupted at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. With devastating effect, invisible enemies poured fire into the packed British ranks from positions of perfect concealment. The regular soldiers, trained to fight in open European battlefields, found themselves helpless against an enemy they could neither see nor reach. Their famous discipline became a liability as they stood in neat ranks, presenting perfect targets. While their officers shouted increasingly desperate orders, Captain Beaujeu fell early in the engagement, struck down by a British volley, but his death only seemed to inspire greater fury among his allies. The Native American warriors, led by experienced war chiefs, demonstrated the effectiveness of their traditional tactics against European military doctrine. They moved like ghosts through the forest, appearing long enough to fire before melting. Back into the undergrowth, Braddock's artillery, so carefully transported across hundreds of miles of wilderness, became useless in the dense forest. The massive siege guns that were meant to reduce Fort Duquesne could not be brought to bear against scattered enemies hiding behind trees. Instead, the artillery crews became prime targets for Native American marksmen, who picked them off with deadly accuracy. The British regulars, despite their training and discipline, began to panic as their ranks were decimated by an enemy they could not see. Officers fell at an alarming rate as Native American warriors specifically targeted anyone giving orders. The careful formations that had won victories across Europe became death traps in the Pennsylvania wilderness. Washington, despite suffering from fever and dysentery, had 2 horses shot from under him and 4 bullet holes through his coat, yet miraculously survived the carnage. His performance during the disaster helped restore his military reputation and demonstrated the leadership qualities that would later make him indispensable to American independence. The morning mist rose from the pristine waters of Lake George as Baron Ludwig August d'Escaux surveyed the British fortifications through his spyglass. It was September 8, 1755, and the German-born French commander faced a decision that would determine the fate of the crucial Lake Champlain corridor. Fresh from his devastating victory over Braddock at the Monongahela, D'Esco commanded nearly 4,000 French regulars, Canadian militia, and Native American allies, a force that should have been sufficient to crush any British resistance. In the northern wilderness, Sir William Johnson, the British commander, had established a fortified camp at the southern end of Lake George, blocking French access to the Hudson River Valley and the vital route to Albany. Johnson's force of approximately 3,000 men represented a mixture of British regulars, colonial militia, and Mohawk warriors led by Chief Hendrick, a legendary figure whose diplomatic skills had kept the powerful Iroquois Confederacy. Allied with the British cause, the strategic importance of this position could not be overstated. Control of the Lake Champlain-Lake George corridor would determine whether French forces could strike directly at the heart of British colonial settlements, or whether British armies could advance northward toward the vital French strongholds of Montreal and Quebec. The outcome of this engagement would influence the entire course of the war in North America. D'Esco's confidence is understandable given his recent successes. The shocking defeat of Braddock had demonstrated that European military tactics could be successfully adapted to wilderness warfare when properly applied. His force included some of the finest soldiers in the French army, veterans of European campaigns who had proven their worth in the forests of America. The Native American allies, flushed with victory and loaded with British scalps, seemed eager for another engagement. The battle began with a tragic miscalculation that would haunt both sides. Chief Hendrick, the aging Mohawk leader whose wisdom had guided British-Iroquois relations for decades, led a reconnaissance force of 1,000 men directly into D'Esco's trap. The French commander had positioned his troops in a masterful ambush along the military road, creating a killing field that would become known as the Bloody Morning Scout. Historical documentation from the New York Colonial Archives reveals that Chief Hendrick's final words before the battle were a prophetic warning. If they are to fight, they are too few. If they are to die, they are too many. The ambush erupted, with devastating effect, as French volleys poured into the British column from concealed positions. Chief Hendrick fell early in the engagement, struck down while attempting to rally his warriors. His death sent shockwaves through the Iroquois ranks and threatened to collapse the entire British alliance with the powerful Confederacy. The surviving British forces fled in disorder back to Johnson's fortified camp. Carrying news of the disaster, however, D'Esco's moment of triumph quickly turned to strategic miscalculation. Rather than consolidating his victory and withdrawing to defensive positions, the French commander decided to pursue the fleeing British forces and assault Johnson's fortified camp. This decision would prove to be a fatal error that transformed certain victory into devastating defeat. Johnson's camp, hastily fortified with overturned wagons, felled trees, and earthworks, provided his men with significant defensive advantages. The British and colonial forces, many of whom had gained valuable experience in previous frontier engagements, were well suited to defensive warfare. When D'Esco's forces emerged from the forest to assault the camp, they found themselves facing disciplined volleys from protected positions. The French assault began promisingly as Canadian militia and Native American allies infiltrated the British perimeter and created chaos within the camp. However, the attack lacked coordination and sufficient artillery support to breach the improvised fortifications. Johnson's men, fighting for their lives with their backs to the lake, demonstrated remarkable tenacity in repelling successive French charges. The turning point came when Sir William Johnson himself was wounded, but continued to direct the defense from his tent. His leadership inspired the colonial forces to maintain their positions despite mounting casualties. The British artillery, better positioned than at Braddock's defeat, began to take a terrible toll on the attacking French forces. Baron D'Esco, leading from the front in the tradition of French military honor, was severely wounded and captured during the final assault. His fall demoralized the French forces and led to the collapse of their attack. The surviving French troops withdrew northward, leaving the British in control of the crucial southern approach to Lake Champlain. The Battle of Lake George represented the first major British victory in the French and Indian War, providing desperately needed morale after the disasters at Fort Necessity and the Monongahela. Johnson's success demonstrated that colonial forces, properly led and positioned, could defeat even the finest European troops. The victory also secured the vital alliance with the Iroquois Confederacy, ensuring that the British would not face a united Native American front. The pre-dawn darkness of September 13th, 1759, shrouded the cliffs of Quebec as Major General James Breeze. Wolfe studied the imposing fortress city that had defied British conquest for decades. The 32-year-old commander, weakened by fever and racked with pain from chronic ailments, knew that his ambitious gamble would either secure British dominance in North America or end in catastrophic defeat. The fate of two empires hung in the balance as his 4,000 men prepared for the most audacious military operation in colonial American history. Quebec represented the ultimate prize in the struggle for North America. The great stone fortress, perched on towering cliffs above the St. Lawrence River, controlled access to the vast interior of the continent. From Quebec, French explorers, traders, and missionaries had penetrated deep into the wilderness, establishing a network of alliances with Native American tribes that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The capture of Quebec would sever the head of this vast empire and ensure British control of the continent. The Marquis de Montcalm, the French commander, had transformed Quebec into what appeared to be an impregnable fortress. The city's natural defenses were formidable sheer cliffs, rising over 200 feet above the river, provided protection from direct assault, while the heavily fortified lower town controlled access to the waterfront. Montcalm's garrison of nearly 16,000 men included some of the finest soldiers in the French army, supported by Canadian militia who knew every inch of the surrounding terrain. Wolfe's siege had begun in June with a devastating bombardment that reduced much of the lower town to rubble, but failed to breach the main fortifications. British naval superiority on the St. Lawrence had isolated Quebec from reinforcement, but Montcalm's defensive strategy of avoiding decisive battle while allowing British forces to exhaust themselves had proven remarkably effective. As autumn approached, Wolfe faced the prospect of withdrawing his army before winter ice made the river impassable. The young general's health had deteriorated dramatically during the siege. Contemporary accounts describe him as a walking skeleton, consumed by fever and barely able to stand without assistance. His officers feared that their commander was dying, yet Wolfe continued to search desperately for a way to break the seemingly hopeless deadlock. Military historians, according to research published in the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, consider Wolfe's final gamble at Quebec as one of the most brilliant tactical innovations in 18th century warfare. The solution came from an unexpected source. Captain Robert Stobo, a former prisoner of the French who had escaped from Quebec, provided crucial intelligence about a narrow path called the Anse de Fallen that led from the river to the plains of Abraham above the city. The path was lightly guarded because the French considered it too steep and dangerous for a military assault. Wolfe saw it as his last hope for victory. The night operation required perfect execution and extraordinary courage. British forces would have to navigate treacherous river currents in darkness, scale nearly vertical cliffs under enemy fire, and deploy for battle before French reinforcements could arrive. A single mistake would result in the destruction of the entire expedition and the collapse of British hopes in North America. Wolfe personally led the advance guard up the cliff face, his frail body driven by indomitable will. The ascent was a nightmare of loose rock, grasping roots, and sheer drops that claimed several lives even before the French discovered the assault. When the first British soldiers reached the top, desperate struggle, as dawn broke over the plains of Abraham, Montcalm received the shocking news that British forces had achieved the impossible. 4,000 enemy soldiers were deployed in battle formation on the plateau above Quebec, threatening the city's vulnerable landward defenses. The French commander faced an agonizing decision: remain within the fortress walls and allow the British to consolidate their position, or risk everything in an immediate counterattack. Montcalm chose to attack, leading nearly 5,000 men across the plains of Abraham in a desperate attempt to drive the British back over the cliffs. The French advance was magnificent in its courage, but tactically flawed in execution. The mixed force of regulars, militia, and Native American allies lacked the coordination necessary for such a complex operation against disciplined British troops. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham lasted less than 30 minutes, but changed the course of world history. British discipline and superior firepower proved decisive as massed volleys shattered the French advance. Both commanders fell mortally wounded. Wolfe died at the moment of victory, reportedly saying, "Now God be praised, I will die in peace." While Montcalm was carried dying into the city he had defended so brilliantly, the fall of Quebec marked the beginning of the end for French power in North America. Although Montreal would hold out for another year, the loss of the great fortress city made ultimate defeat inevitable. The British victory at Quebec ensured that North America would develop as an English-speaking continent. With profound consequences for the future United States, the crisp September air of 1760 carried the scent of autumn leaves and gunpowder as three separate British armies converged on Montreal, the last bastion of French power in North America. Governor Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil watched from the walls of the city as enemy forces approached from three directions, a carefully orchestrated campaign that would decide the fate of New France forever. The young nation that had begun with Jacques Cartier's explorations 2 centuries earlier now faced its final hour. Major General Geoffrey Amherst, the British commander-in-chief, had planned this convergence with meticulous precision. His own army of 10,000 men advanced down the St. Lawrence River from Lake Ontario, while Brigadier General William Haviland led 3,400 troops north from Lake Champlain, and Colonel Murray brought 2,400 men up the river from Quebec. The combined force of over 16,000 soldiers represented the largest military operation ever mounted in North America. The strategic situation was hopeless for the French. The fall of Quebec had severed Montreal's vital supply lines, while British naval dominance prevented any hope of reinforcement from France. The city's garrison numbered fewer than 3,000 men, many of whom were militia with little training and less enthusiasm for a suicidal last stand. Native American allies, recognizing the inevitable outcome, largely abandoned the French cause and begun negotiating separate peace agreements with British commanders. Vaudreuil, the last governor of New France, faced an impossible choice. Military resistance would result in the destruction of Montreal and the massacre of its civilian population. Yet surrender would end 2 centuries of French civilization in North America. The governor's correspondence from this period reveals a man torn between honor and pragmatism, seeking some way to preserve the French-Canadian population while acknowledging the reality of total defeat. The British approach to Montreal demonstrated how much military strategy had evolved since the early disasters of the war. Rather than attempting costly frontal assaults, Amherst employed a systematic strategy of encirclement that made French resistance impossible. British forces seized key positions around the city, established artillery batteries on commanding heights, and gradually tightened their grip until surrender became inevitable. Contemporary accounts from the archives of the Séminaire de Quebec describe the final days of New France as a period of profound melancholy as French colonists prepared for life under British rule. The psychological impact of the converging armies was as devastating as their military effect. French defenders watched in despair as British forces appeared on every horizon, their disciplined ranks stretching endlessly across the landscape. The sight of enemy artillery being positioned on the heights above the city made clear that resistance would result in the complete destruction of Montreal and the death of thousands of civilians. Amherst's diplomatic approach proved as skillful as his military strategy. Rather than demanding unconditional surrender, he offered generous terms that would preserve French-Canadian rights and property. The British commander understood that harsh treatment would create a legacy of resentment that would poison relations with the French population for generations to come. The negotiations that followed were conducted with remarkable civility, considering the stakes involved. Vaudreuil insisted on terms that would protect the French-Canadian population from reprisals and guarantee their right to practice Catholicism. Amherst, recognizing the value of gaining the loyalty of his new subjects, agreed to most of these requests while maintaining British sovereignty over the conquered territory. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 8th. 60. In a scene that symbolized the end of one era and the beginning of another, French troops marched out of Montreal with full military honors, their colors flying and drums beating, while British forces formed lines of respect for their defeated enemies. The ceremony was conducted with dignity that reflected the mutual respect earned through years of hard fighting. The Articles of Capitulation signed at Montreal effectively ended French power in North America while establishing the framework for British rule over the former colony. The agreement guaranteed French-Canadian rights to property, religion, and civil law provisions that would prove crucial to the peaceful transition of power and the eventual development of Canadian identity. With the fall of Montreal, the French and Indian War in North America came to an end after 6 years of devastating conflict. The British victory was complete. French power had been eliminated from the continent, and the way was clear for westward expansion that would eventually create the United States. However, the enormous cost of the war would soon create new tensions between Britain and its American colonies, setting the stage for the next great conflict in North American history. The surrender at Montreal marked more than just a military victory. It represented a fundamental shift in the balance of world power. Britain had eliminated its primary rival in North America and established the foundation for a global empire that would dominate the next century. The French colonists, now British subjects, would adapt to their new circumstances while maintaining their distinct cultural identity, a legacy that continues to shape Canada today. The elegant chambers of the Hôtel de Soubise in Paris buzzed with diplomatic tension as representatives of the world's great powers gathered to negotiate the treaty that would reshape the global balance of power. It was February 10, 1763, and the document being finalized would formally end the 7 Years' War while establishing British dominance over North America. The quill pens scratching across parchment were writing the birth certificate of a new world order that would endure for generations. The Duke of Bedford, representing King George III, sat across from Etienne Francois de Choiseul, the French foreign minister, in negotiations that would determine the fate of millions of people across multiple continents. The British delegation arrived at the conference with overwhelming military advantages that made their negotiating position nearly unassailable. French forces had been defeated in North America, India, and the Caribbean. While the French Navy had been systematically destroyed by British sea power, the scale of British victory was unprecedented in European history. In North America, the conquest of Quebec and Montreal had eliminated French power from the continent. In India, Robert Clive's victory at Plassey had established British control over Bengal and laid the foundation for eventual dominion over the entire subcontinent. In the Caribbean, British forces had captured valuable sugar islands including Martinique and Guadeloupe, while British naval supremacy had severed French colonial communications worldwide. Yet the negotiations were complicated by the entry of Spain into the war on the French side, a decision that had proven catastrophic for Spanish interests. British forces had captured Havana and Manila, two of Spain's most important colonial cities. While Spanish Florida lay exposed to British attack, the Spanish delegation, led by the Marques de Grimaldi, faced the prospect of significant territorial losses to compensate for their ill-timed alliance with France. The British negotiating strategy reflected both triumph and pragmatism. Military victory provided enormous leverage. British leaders recognized that overly harsh terms might create conditions for future conflict. The enormous cost of the war, Britain's national debt had nearly doubled, made peace attractive even if it required some territorial concessions to achieve lasting stability, according to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the British Foreign Office archives. Prime Minister Lord Bute described the negotiations as an opportunity to establish British hegemony while avoiding the mistakes of previous conquerors. The territorial provisions of the treaty were sweeping in their scope. France ceded all of Canada to Britain, including the vast territories of Acadia, Cape Breton Island, and the St. Lawrence River Valley. The loss of these territories effectively ended French ambitions in North America and established British control over the entire continent east of the Mississippi River. The economic value of these acquisitions was enormous. The fur trade alone generated millions of pounds annually for the British Treasury. French Louisiana was divided between Britain and Spain in a complex arrangement that reflected the diplomatic necessities of the moment. The territory east of the Mississippi River was ceded to Britain, while the western portion was secretly transferred to Spain as compensation for Spanish losses in the war. This arrangement eliminated French presence in North America while creating a buffer zone between British and Spanish territories. The Caribbean provisions generated intense debate among British negotiators. The sugar islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe were immensely valuable. Some economists argued they were worth more than all of Canada. However, the British government ultimately decided to return these islands to France in exchange for recognition of British sovereignty over Canada. This decision reflected a strategic vision that valued continental territories over island possessions. Spain's territorial losses were severe, but not catastrophic. The cession of Florida to Britain was painful, but inevitable, given Spanish military failures. In compensation, Spain received Louisiana from France, a vast territory that would provide room for expansion and development. The return of Havana and Manila to Spanish control helped soften the blow of losing Florida. The treaties' provisions regarding Native American populations were tragically inadequate. The complex system of alliances and territorial arrangements that had characterized French colonial policy was swept away without adequate consultation with indigenous peoples. The British government's promise to respect Native American land rights would prove largely worthless as colonial settlement expanded westward. The economic implications of the treaty were staggering. Britain emerged from the war as the world's dominant commercial power, with control over the most valuable trade routes in colonial territories. The elimination of French competition in North America and India created opportunities for unprecedented economic expansion. However, the enormous cost of the war had created a financial crisis that would soon generate new conflicts with American colonists. The signing ceremony on February 10, 1763, was conducted with appropriate pomp and ceremony. Representatives of Britain, France, and Spain affixed their signatures to a document that formally ended the most destructive war in 18th century history. The treaty represented not just the end of a conflict but the beginning of a new era of British global dominance. The long-term consequences of the Treaty of Paris extended far beyond the immediate territorial adjustments. The elimination of French power in North America removed a crucial check on British colonial expansion, setting the stage for inevitable conflicts with Native American populations. The enormous cost of the war created fiscal pressures that would lead directly to the taxation disputes that sparked the American Revolution. The treaty also established precedents for future diplomatic negotiations. The principle that military victory should be translated into territorial gains became a standard feature of international relations. The careful balance between punishment and reconciliation demonstrated in the treaty would influence diplomatic practice for generations. Most importantly, the Treaty of Paris marked the emergence of the British Empire as the dominant global power. The territorial acquisitions in North America, combined with expanding influence in India and naval supremacy worldwide, created the foundation for British hegemony that would last until the 20th century. The young George Washington now, a seasoned veteran of wilderness warfare, would soon discover that victory over France had created new challenges that would ultimately lead to American independence and the birth of a new nation.